for me, queering psychology is about depathologization. My work looks a lot at the history of psychology and compares it to today. And it's just impossible to know that without being very aware of how queerness has been very negatively represented within psychology in a lot of the historical texts and works. And that observing those changes, but also being aware of how a lot of those negative representations are still carried through in certain spaces in psychology for that. So for me, queering psychology is addressing that, changing that, countering that, producing discourses and narratives that center queerness in a way that isn't framing it as an abnormality. That's kind of one big part of it. And the other part for me is not just so much as creating more positive narratives about queerness that moves it away from mental illness and all that kind of thing, but decentering heterosexuality and deconstructing that norm that has been produced over such a long period of time. It's just so strong and so influential that even in spaces that aren't, outwardly homophobic or framing queerness as abnormal, you still find that it's either considered as like an extra on the side, if it's considered at all. So I think there's been a couple of times where I've been really surprised, and maybe I shouldn't be, but I remember talking to a researcher once who's talking about parenting. That was kind of the research area. And I was chatting about the research that I do. And they're like, oh, that's so interesting. But, sexuality isn't really relevant to my work. And I was kind of like, is there a reason you don't think queer parents exist? And there's these kind of decisions where people think that queerness is only relevant in sexuality studies and that queer people only belong in this little subcategory over here, So for me, queering psychology is about challenging that. I want to see queer people included in studies on bullying, on workplace harassment, on the most mundane topics. It should be, because people exist. And if you're not including them in your research, then you need to state why. If you're studying heterosexuality and parenting, then that's what you're studying. But if you say that you're studying parenting, then you need to have a broader kind of representation of people you're considering. So that's for me, depathologization and deconstructing that norm that excludes queerness.